Hey everyone, and welcome back. Tonight we dim the lights and settle into something ancient, something that predates pyramids and empires, something written in wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay over 4,000 years ago. Before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these explorations into forgotten histories. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your world. It's always fascinating to see how many of us gather here across time zones to explore the mysteries that came before us. Now adjust your volume, maybe light a candle or turn on that soft background fan, and let's journey together into the cradle of civilization. We're heading to ancient Mesopotamia, to the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where humanity first learned to write, where the first cities rose from dust and ambition, and where stories were told of beings called the Anunnaki. You've probably heard the name before, whispered in documentaries about ancient aliens, claimed as evidence of extraterrestrial visitors who descended from the stars to mine gold and genetically engineer humanity. The internet overflows with theories, YouTube channels dedicated to decoding ancient symbols, best-selling books promising to reveal the truth that mainstream archaeology supposedly hides. But tonight, we're not here for sensationalism. We're here for something more grounded, more fascinating in its reality than any alien theory could provide. We're here to examine what the actual Sumerian texts say about the Anunnaki, to understand who they really were in the eyes of the ancient people who worshipped them, and to explore why the truth might be even stranger than fiction. The story begins not in space but in southern Mesopotamia, in what is now modern-day Iraq. Around 4,500 years before the Common Era, as hunter-gatherer societies were giving way to agricultural settlements, something remarkable happened. People began to gather in increasingly large communities along the fertile banks of two great rivers. They learned to control water through irrigation, transforming the landscape into productive farmland. They built structures from mud bricks, organized labor, established trade networks, and most importantly, they developed a system to record their world. This was the dawn of the Sumerian civilization, one of humanity's first urban cultures. These weren't primitive people stumbling through existence. They were sophisticated engineers who designed complex irrigation systems, mathematicians who developed a base 60 counting system we still use today to measure time and angles, astronomers who tracked celestial movements with remarkable accuracy, and administrators who needed to keep records of an increasingly complex society. That need for record-keeping gave birth to something revolutionary. Around 3,200 years before the Common Era, in the ancient city of Uruk, someone pressed a reed stylus into soft clay and created marks that represented not just pictures, but ideas, sounds, and eventually full language. This was cuneiform, from the Latin word cuneus meaning wedge, named for the distinctive wedge-shaped impressions that formed its characters. It wasn't the only early writing system, as Egyptian hieroglyphics and ancient Chinese script were developing around the same time, but cuneiform would become the most widespread writing system in the ancient Near East, adapted by numerous cultures over 3 millennia. The process was ingenious in its simplicity. Scribes would take fresh clay, form it into flat tablets, and while the clay was still damp they would use a cut reed with a triangular end to press symbols into the surface. Each impression created a wedge. These wedges combined in different patterns to create hundreds of distinct signs. The tablets would then be left to dry in the sun or baked in kilns, preserving the text for thousands of years. What began as simple pictographs, little pictures representing objects like grain or cattle, evolved into something far more sophisticated. The symbols became increasingly abstract, moving away from representational images towards stylized combinations of wedges. The system developed phonetic elements, where symbols could represent sounds rather than just objects or ideas. This allowed scribes to write not just nouns and numbers, but complex sentences expressing abstract thoughts, emotions, laws, and stories. Think about what this meant. For the first time in human history, thoughts could outlive the thinker. Stories could be preserved exactly as told. Laws could be recorded and referenced. Accounts could be kept with precision. Knowledge could accumulate across generations. This wasn't just a technological innovation. It was a cognitive revolution that fundamentally changed what it meant to be human. The Sumerians used this writing system for everything. Archaeological excavations have uncovered thousands upon thousands of clay tablets. Most of them are mundane. Administrative records tracking grain distributions, temple inventories listing offerings to the gods, legal contracts detailing business transactions, student exercises showing apprentice scribes practicing their letters. But among these everyday documents, archaeologists found something else. They found literature, real literature, some of the oldest stories ever written. They found myths explaining how the world came to be, epics recounting the adventures of kings and heroes, hymns praising the gods, lamentations mourning destroyed cities, and running through many of these texts, appearing again and again, was a term that would later capture imaginations around the world. The Anunnaki. But who were they really? To understand the Anunnaki, we need to understand the Sumerian worldview. The Sumerians didn't separate the natural from the supernatural the way we do. The world was alive with divine presence. Every city had its patron deity who resided in the city's temple and was expected to protect its interests. The sky, the earth, the water, the wind, all were governed by gods with distinct personalities and domains of influence. These weren't distant, abstract forces. They were beings with emotions, desires, conflicts, and relationships. They could be pleased or angered, generous or vengeful, wise or foolish. The word Anunnaki itself tells us something important. In Sumerian, it likely derives from a phrase meaning something like princely offspring or those of royal blood. The term connected these deities to An, also called Anu in Akkadian, the god of the heavens, the father of the gods. The Anunnaki were essentially the children of heaven, the descendants of the supreme deity. They weren't a fixed group with consistent membership. Different texts mention different numbers. Some sources suggest 7 judges of the dead in the underworld. Others speak of 50 Anunnaki associated with the city of Eridu. The Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, mentions 600 Anunnaki, with 300 assigned to duty in the heavens and 300 in the netherworld. What's clear is that the Anunnaki weren't all-powerful creators separate from other gods. They were part of the larger Mesopotamian pantheon, a term used to describe the highest-ranking deities, the ones who held real power and influence. The text described them as having various functions. They were judges who decided fates, administrators who managed cosmic affairs, and participants in the great events of mythological history. Let's examine some specific texts to see how the Anunnaki actually appear in Sumerian literature, not filtered through modern interpretations, but in their original context. Before we dive into the specific texts, we need to understand how these ancient documents came to light. The rediscovery of cuneiform and the decipherment of Sumerian is itself an extraordinary story. For nearly 2,000 years, these texts lay buried and forgotten. The Sumerian language died out completely, replaced by Akkadian and then other languages. Knowledge of how to read cuneiform vanished. The cities that once dominated Mesopotamia crumbled into tells. Artificial mounds formed from centuries of accumulated rubble and rebuilding. In the 19th century, European explorers and archaeologists began excavating these ancient sites. They found thousands of clay tablets covered in strange wedge-shaped marks, but they couldn't read them. The script was completely unknown. The first breakthrough came from the Behistun inscription, a massive trilingual text carved into a cliff face in Persia by the Persian king Darius the Great. It was written in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, all in cuneiform script. British Army officer Henry Rawlinson risked his life copying this inscription from the dangerous cliff face in the 1840s. By comparing the 3 versions, scholars slowly began to crack the code. They started with Old Persian, which was somewhat related to known languages. From there, they worked their way to Babylonian, a form of Akkadian written in cuneiform. But Sumerian was even older and completely unrelated to any known language family. It's what linguists call a language isolate, with no clear connection to other languages. Deciphering it required painstaking work, comparing thousands of tablets, identifying patterns, building vocabularies word by word. Scholars like Jules Opper, Edward Hincks, and Henry Rawlinson pioneered this work in the mid-1800s. George Smith, a banknote engraver turned Assyriologist, made one of the most sensational discoveries. In 1872, while examining tablets from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, he found fragments of what we now call the Epic of Gilgamesh. More specifically, he found the flood story, predating the biblical flood narrative by over 1,000 years. The discovery caused a sensation. Newspapers around the world reported that an ancient Mesopotamian version of Noah's flood had been found. The Daily Telegraph newspaper actually funded an expedition for Smith to return to Nineveh to find more of the epic, which he did, though tragically he died of disease during a subsequent expedition at age 36. The decipherment of cuneiform opened an entire lost world. Suddenly we could read the oldest literature humanity had produced. We could see how the first cities were organized, what laws governed them, what prices merchants charged, what students learned, what gods were worshipped, what stories were told. It was as if a vast library had suddenly become readable after being sealed for 2 millennia. And within that library, among all the texts about kings and conquests, about trade and taxes, about planting and harvesting, were the stories of the gods. The Sumerians were deeply religious people. Their entire society revolved around temples and the worship of deities. Each city-state had its own patron god or goddess. Uruk belonged to An, the sky god, and his granddaughter Inanna, goddess of love and war. Eridu was sacred to Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. Nippur was the cult centre of Enlil, god of air and storms, considered the king of the gods. These weren't just religious centres. The temples were economic powerhouses, owning vast tracts of land, employing thousands of workers, controlling trade networks, functioning as banks and warehouses. The priests who served in these temples weren't just spiritual leaders. They were administrators, economists, scribes, astronomers, and judges. They organized labor for building projects, managed agricultural production, distributed rations to workers, kept detailed records of everything. The temple precinct in a Sumerian city might occupy a quarter or more of the urban area with massive ziggurats, multi-story stepped pyramids made of mud brick dominating the skyline. These ziggurats weren't tombs like Egyptian pyramids. They were believed to be stairways connecting earth to heaven, allowing gods to descend and humans to ascend toward the divine. At the top stood a shrine where the city's patron deity was thought to reside. Priests would climb the steep stairs to bring offerings, perform rituals, and consult the god on behalf of the city. This was the world that produced the Anunnaki myths, a world where the divine and human realms constantly interacted, where gods were immediate and present, where temple and palace shared authority, where writing served both sacred and secular purposes. Now let's turn to the texts themselves, starting with one of the most vivid appearances of the Anunnaki in Sumerian literature. One of the most complete and fascinating texts featuring the Anunnaki is the poem called Inanna's Descent to the Underworld, composed sometime between 1900 and 1600 years before the Common Era. This is one of the oldest surviving pieces of literature in the world, and it tells a remarkable story that reveals much about Sumerian theology and the role of the Anunnaki within it. Inanna, also known as Ishtar in the Akkadian language, was one of the most important deities in the entire Mesopotamian pantheon. She was the goddess of love, beauty, sex, desire, fertility, war, combat, justice, and political power. Her symbols were the lion, representing her martial aspect, and the 8-pointed star, representing Venus, the planet sacred to her. She was called the Queen of Heaven, and her cult was extraordinarily widespread. Her main temple, the Inanna, was in Uruk, one of the greatest cities of ancient Mesopotamia. Inanna was a complex deity, embodying contradictions that the Sumerians apparently found powerful and meaningful. She was associated with sexual love but also with virginity. She brought fertility to the land but could also bring destruction. She protected kings but could also overthrow them. She was beautiful and seductive but also fierce and terrifying in battle. Ancient hymns describe her as clothed in terror, dripping with blood after battle, irresistible in her beauty, merciless to her enemies. The poem of her descent begins with these famous haunting lines. From the great above she opened her ear to the great below. From the great above the goddess opened her ear to the great below. From the great above Inanna opened her ear to the great below. The repetition is deliberate, emphasizing the momentous nature of what's about to happen. Inanna, who rules from the heights of heaven, who commands worship across Mesopotamia, who sits in glory in her temple, decides to visit the underworld, the realm of death from which none return. Different versions of the myth give different reasons for her descent. Some say she went to attend the funeral rites for Gugalanna, the bull of heaven, husband of her sister Ereshkigal who ruled the underworld. This might have been a sisterly duty, though given the relationship between Inanna and Ereshkigal, duty mixed with tension seems more likely. Other interpretations suggest Inanna went to extend her power, to conquer even the realm of death, to add rulership of the underworld to her already impressive portfolio of divine authority. This fits her character as depicted in other myths, ambitious and unwilling to accept any limits to her domain. Whatever her motivation, Inanna prepared carefully for the journey. She dressed herself in all her divine regalia, each piece representing an aspect of her power and authority. She wore the shugura, the crown of the plain, marking her as ruler. She placed small lapis lazuli beads around her neck, a precious stone representing wealth and status. She hung twin egg-shaped beads on her breast, symbols of fertility. She clothed herself in the pala dress, the garment of ladyship, identifying her noble status. She darkened her eyes with ointment called "Let a Man Come," emphasizing her seductive power. She wore a pectoral called "Come, Man, Come," another symbol of sexual attraction. She placed a golden ring on her hand indicating wealth and authority, and she carried the lapis lazuli measuring rod and line, symbols of justice and divine law. Fully arrayed in these 7 divine powers, she set out for the underworld, accompanied part of the way by her faithful servant and advisor Ninshuba. Before descending, Inanna gave Ninshuba crucial instructions. "If I do not return after 3 days and 3 nights," she said, "you must go to the gods for help. First go to Enlil in Nippur. If he refuses to help, go to Nanna in Ur. If he refuses, go to Enki in Eridu. Tell them what has happened and beg them to save me." These instructions reveal something important about the divine hierarchy. Inanna knew she was taking a terrible risk. The underworld had its own rules, its own sovereign, and even the Queen of Heaven couldn't simply assume she'd be welcome or safe there. She was entering her sister's domain, and Ereshkigal might not appreciate the visit. The relationship between these 2 sisters is never explicitly detailed in the texts, but the tension is palpable. Ereshkigal ruled the realm of death, a grim and thankless job. Inanna ruled the realms of life, love, beauty and power, enjoying worship and glory. It's not hard to imagine resentment festering between them. Inanna approached the first of 7 gates that guarded the entrance to the underworld. A gatekeeper named Neti challenged her. "Who are you, and why have you come to the land of no return?" Inanna identified herself as the Queen of Heaven coming to attend her brother-in-law's funeral. The gatekeeper went to inform Ereshkigal of her sister's arrival. Ereshkigal's reaction was immediate and revealing. She bit her lip in rage. She spoke to Neti with fury in her voice. "Come, Neti, my chief gatekeeper of the underworld. Do not neglect the instructions I give you. Bolt the 7 gates of the underworld. Then let Inanna enter. As she enters, remove her royal garments. Let the holy priestess of heaven bow low." The instructions were clear and cruel. Ereshkigal would allow Inanna to enter, but she would be stripped of everything that made her powerful. At each of the 7 gates, Neti removed one of Inanna's divine powers. At the first gate, the shugura was taken from her head. At the second gate, the lapis lazuli beads were removed from her neck. At the third gate, the twin beads were taken from her breast. At the 4th gate, the pala dress was pulled from her body. At the 5th gate, the golden ring was removed from her hand. At the 6th gate, the lapis lazuli, measuring rod and line were taken. At the 7th and final gate, even the garments covering her body were removed. At each gate, as her possessions were taken, Inanna protested. "What is this?" Neti responded the same way each time. "Be satisfied, Inanna. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned." By the time she passed through the 7th gate and entered the throne room of her sister, Inanna was completely naked and defenseless, stripped of every symbol of her divine authority and power. She had descended from the heights of heaven to the depths of the underworld, from clothed in glory to naked vulnerability, from the Queen of Heaven to a supplicant entering another's domain. She walked toward the throne where Ereshkigal sat, but she never reached it. The text describes what happened next with stark, brutal clarity. The Anunnaki, the 7 judges of the underworld, surrounded her. They passed judgment against her. They looked at her. It was the look of death. They spoke to her. It was the speech of anger. They shouted at her. It was the shout of heavy guilt. The afflicted woman was turned into a corpse, a piece of rotting meat, and was hung from a hook on the wall. This is the Anunnaki in their role as judges of the dead, one of their primary functions in Sumerian and Akkadian mythology. They aren't creators of life or genetic engineers. They aren't mining gold or building technological marvels. They're administering cosmic justice, serving as the divine tribunal that pronounces judgment on those who enter the realm of death. Notice the specific language the text uses. They looked at her. It was the look of death. Their gaze itself had power. They spoke to her. It was the speech of anger. Their words carried divine force. They shouted at her. It was the shout of heavy guilt. Their pronouncement transformed reality. This is divine power, operating in the way ancient peoples universally understood it. Gods could command reality through speech, through will, through focused intention. They didn't need technology. Their divine nature itself was the mechanism of power. The Anunnaki judged. Inanna guilty. Guilty of what exactly? The text never explicitly says, but scholars have debated this for decades. Hubris seems the most likely charge. Inanna attempted to extend her power into a realm that wasn't hers. She entered the land of death while still alive, violating the fundamental boundary between life and death. She came to her sister's domain without proper humility, perhaps even intending to usurp Ereshkigal's throne, to become queen of both heaven and the underworld. The underworld had rules, ancient and inviolable. The living do not belong there. The dead cannot leave. Each realm has its sovereign. These rules maintain cosmic order, the balance between life and death, between the world above and the world below. Inanna's arrival, alive and clothed in power, would have disrupted that order. The Anunnaki, as enforcers of cosmic law, could not allow this transgression. They condemned her to death, and Ereshkigal executed the sentence. She fastened on Inanna the eye of death. She spoke against her the word of wrath. She uttered against her the cry of guilt. She struck her, and Inanna was turned into a corpse, rotting meat hung on a hook like an animal carcass in a butcher shop. The mighty Queen of Heaven reduced to carrion. 3 days and 3 nights passed. Inanna did not return. Her servant Ninshubur, true to her word, began the process of seeking help. She went to Enlil in Nippur and threw herself before him, weeping and pleading. "My mistress has not returned from the underworld. Please help her." Enlil refused coldly. "Inanna has gone to the great below. The underworld is not a place anyone returns from. She desired the power of the underworld and must accept the consequences. I will not help her." Ninshubur next tried Nanna, the moon god, Inanna's father in some versions of her genealogy. Surely a father would save his daughter. But Nanna also refused with the same reasoning. She went to the underworld of her own free will. She must face whatever awaits her there. Finally Ninshubur came to Enki in Eridu. Enki, the god of wisdom, magic and fresh water, was known in Sumerian mythology as clever, compassionate toward humanity, and willing to bend rules when circumstances warranted. He was the god who warned humanity about the coming flood in the Atrahasis epic. He was the trickster, the problem solver, the one who found loopholes in divine decrees. When Ninshubur told him of Inanna's fate, Enki reacted differently. He took dirt from under his fingernail and created 2 beings, neither male nor female. The text calls them the Kurgara and the Galata, creatures without gender who could move between realms undetected. He gave them specific instructions. Go to the underworld like flies, slipping in unnoticed. Find Ereshkigal. She will be in the throes of labor, experiencing terrible pain, crying out in agony. When she cries out, echo her cries. Sympathize with her pain. Groan when she groans. This will touch her heart and she will offer you a gift. When she does, ask for the corpse hanging on the hook." The two creatures did exactly as Enki instructed. They entered the underworld like flies, small and unnoticed. They found Ereshkigal in the midst of birthing pains, writhing and crying out. The text describes her state vividly. No linen was spread over her body, her breasts were uncovered, her hair swirled around her head like leeks. She was in the throes of a labour that seemed to have no end, experiencing pain that even a goddess found unbearable. The Kugara and Galatur did something no one else had done. They sympathized with her suffering. They echoed her cries. "Oh, you're inside? Oh, you're outside?" They groaned with her. They felt compassion for her pain. Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, ruler of the dead, had likely never experienced genuine compassion before. Everyone feared her. Everyone avoided her realm. She was powerful but isolated, ruling over a grim domain, queen of death itself. When these strange creatures showed her sympathy, something in her heart melted. She stopped crying and looked at them. "Who are you?" she asked. "Why do you groan with me?" They didn't really answer, just continued to express concern for her suffering. Moved by their compassion, Ereshkigal said, "You have comforted me in my pain. Ask me for anything, and I will give it to you. Water from the river? It is yours. Grain from the fields? Take it." They responded exactly as Enki had instructed. "We wish only for the corpse that hangs from the hook on the wall." Ereshkigal couldn't refuse. She had made a promise, and even the queen of the underworld was bound by her word. "The corpse is yours," she said. The Kugara and Galata took Inanna's body and sprinkled it with the food and water of life that Enki had given them. The corpse began to stir. Colour returned to the flesh. Breath returned to the lungs. Inanna was alive again, resurrected from death through the clever intervention of Enki and the compassion shown to a suffering goddess. But there was a catch, and it's an important one that reveals much about Sumerian theology. As Inanna prepared to leave the underworld, demons called the Gala surrounded her. They were the enforcers of underworld law, and they had one inflexible rule. No one ascends from the underworld unscathed. If Inanna leaves, someone must take her place. The dead must remain in their realm. The land of death cannot be cheated. If one soul escapes, another must descend. The Gala accompanied Inanna as she ascended from the underworld, back through the 7 gates where her divine powers were returned to her one by one. They followed her back to the surface world with a single purpose, to seize her replacement. Inanna tried to protect those loyal to her. When she found Ninshubur, her faithful servant dressed in sackcloth and mourning for her mistress, the Gala moved to seize her. "No," Inanna commanded, "not this one. She mourned for me. She went to the gods seeking my rescue. She is faithful and deserves protection." The Gala had to obey. She found Shara, her beautician, also dressed in sackcloth and mourning. The Gala moved toward him. "No," Inanna said again. "Not this one either. He mourned for me. Leave him be." The same thing happened with Lulal, her warrior. He too had mourned, dressed in sackcloth, performing the proper rituals of grief. Inanna protected him as well. But then she arrived at her own temple in Uruk, her sacred precinct, the center of her worship. And there, sitting on her throne, dressed in magnificent robes, seemingly unconcerned, was her husband Dumuzi, also called Tammuz. He hadn't mourned her absence. He hadn't dressed in sackcloth. He hadn't wept or performed funeral rites. He had simply taken her throne and continued ruling as if nothing had happened, as if the Queen of Heaven hadn't descended to the realm of death, as if her possible permanent absence was a matter of no concern. The text describes Inanna's reaction with terrible clarity. She fastened on him the eye of death. She spoke against him the word of wrath. "Take this one." The Gala seized Dumuzi, overjoyed to have their prey. Dumuzi fled, terrified, calling out for help to the sun god Utu, asking to be transformed so he could escape. The text breaks into fragments here, but we know from other sources how the story resolves. Dumuzi's sister Geshti Nana, loyal and loving, intervened on her brother's behalf. She offered to take his place for part of the year. A compromise was reached. Dumuzi would spend 6 months in the underworld, and Geshti Nana would spend the other 6 months there. ensuring that the land of the dead always had its due. This resolution connected to seasonal cycles. Dumuzi was associated with shepherds and vegetation. His descent to the underworld for half the year represented the dry season when plants died and the land became barren. His return represented the growing season when life returned. The ancient Sumerians saw the natural cycles of death and rebirth in their landscape reflected in the divine realm. The gods' stories explained why summer came and went, why crops grew and died, why the world moved through cycles of plenty and scarcity. This long, complex myth reveals several crucial things about how the Sumerians understood the Anunnaki. First, they were powerful but operated within a system of cosmic law. They judged according to established rules. They couldn't simply do whatever they wished. The laws of the underworld bound even them. Second, they served specific functions. The 7 Anunnaki judges in the underworld weren't rulers or creators. They were administrators of justice in the realm of death, ensuring that cosmic order was maintained. Third, they could be cruel, but their cruelty followed logic. Inanna violated underworld law by entering alive, by attempting to extend her power where it didn't belong. The Anunnaki condemned her for real. Transgression, not arbitrary malice. Fourth, they were part of a larger divine system where different gods had different domains and different roles. Enlil and Nanna wouldn't help Inanna because they respected the boundaries between realms. Enki helped because he was clever and compassionate, characteristics associated with his particular divine nature. Fifth, the myth assumes gods could die, at least temporarily, and be resurrected. Inanna truly died. She became a corpse, not metaphorically or symbolically, but actually dead according to the logic of the story. The text describes her body hanging on a hook in the underworld, lifeless meat, divine essence extinguished. But death wasn't necessarily permanent for divine beings, not in the way it was for mortals. With the right intervention, with the correct rituals, with assistance from other gods, resurrection was possible, though it came at a steep cost. Someone always had to pay the price. Someone always had to take the place of the one being rescued from death's domain. Sixth, the relationship between gods and humans mirrored social relationships in profound ways. Just as a king might demand service and loyalty from subjects, expecting tribute, obedience, and recognition of authority, gods demanded worship and loyalty from devotees, requiring sacrifices, prayers, and acknowledgement of their power. Just as subjects might be punished for transgression against royal decree, Inanna was punished for violating cosmic law, for attempting to extend her dominion beyond its proper limits, for challenging the boundaries established by divine order. The divine realm reflected human society, magnified to cosmic scale, with all the same hierarchies, conflicts, and power dynamics that governed earthly kingdoms. Seventh, the myth taught moral lessons that resonated through Sumerian culture. Loyalty was rewarded in concrete ways, as Ninshuber's faithfulness, her refusal to abandon her queen, her persistence in seeking help from multiple gods, ultimately saved her from being taken to the underworld as a substitute. She remained free because she had proven herself trustworthy and devoted. Disloyalty or indifference was punished severely, as Dumuzi's apparent unconcern for Inanna's fate. His comfortable position on his throne while she suffered in death's realm led directly to his seizure by the demons. His failure to mourn, his failure to show proper respect or concern, marked him as expendable in the eyes of cosmic justice. Hubris had consequences that could be catastrophic, as Inanna's attempt to extend her power beyond its proper limits, her desire to rule both the world above and the world below, nearly resulted in her permanent death. The gods had their assigned domains, their proper spheres of influence, and attempts to transgress those boundaries invited disaster. These are the real Anunnaki as they appear in actual Sumerian literature, in texts composed by scribes who lived in Mesopotamian cities, who served in temples, who recorded the religious beliefs of their culture with care and precision. Not aliens or genetic engineers travelling from distant planets with advanced technology. Not extraterrestrial miners extracting gold from the earth. Not scientists conducting biological experiments in laboratories, but divine judges serving a specific function in Sumerian theology, maintaining cosmic order, ensuring that even the gods themselves were subject to laws governing life, death, and the boundaries between realms. They were the enforcers of divine justice, the keepers of balance, the stern judges who allowed no exceptions, granted no mercy, followed the rules absolutely. They represented the principle that law applied to everyone, even to powerful deities like Inanna, that certain boundaries must not be crossed, that the order of the universe depended on everyone staying in their proper place. The Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the most famous work of ancient Mesopotamian literature and one of the oldest surviving literary masterpieces in human history, also features the Anunnaki, though more briefly and in a different context than the Inanna myth. This epic, composed over many centuries and existing in multiple versions across different time periods and regions, tells the story of Gilgamesh, the semi-divine king of Uruk, and his profound quest to understand death and find eternal life, a quest born from grief and existential terror. The standard version we have today, the one most widely studied and translated, comes from tablets found in the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, dating to the 7th century before the Common Era, though the stories themselves are much older, with Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh and his exploits dating back to around 2100 years before the Common Era, making this one of humanity's oldest extended narratives. Gilgamesh was, according to the Sumerian king list, a historical document that chronicles the reigns of kings in ancient Mesopotamia, the 5th king of Uruk, ruling sometime around 2700 years before the Common Era during the early dynastic period. Whether he was a real historical figure remains debated among scholars and historians, with some arguing he was an actual ruler whose deeds became mythologized over time, while others suggest he may have been entirely legendary from the start. But the Sumerians themselves certainly believed he was real, treated him as an ancestor, and constructed elaborate myths around his exploits, adventures, and ultimate fate. The epic describes him as 2/3 god and 1/3 human, an unusual fraction suggesting divine parentage mixed with mortal blood, making him extraordinarily powerful but still subject to death. He's described as incredibly strong, capable of feats beyond normal human capacity, beautiful in appearance, charismatic and commanding, and fierce in battle, but also arrogant and tyrannical as a young king, oppressing his own people through excessive demands and abuse of royal power. The story tells how Gilgamesh met and befriended Enkidu, a wild man who had lived among animals in the wilderness, innocent of civilization, knowing nothing of cities, agriculture, or human culture. The gods created Enkidu specifically to be Gilgamesh's equal and challenger, someone who could match the king's strength and hopefully curb his worst excesses. After Enkidu was civilized through the intervention of a temple prostitute who taught him human ways, introduced him to bread, beer, and clothing, he travelled to Uruk and confronted Gilgamesh. They fought fiercely, shaking buildings and tearing up streets with the violence of their combat, but neither could defeat the other. In their mutual respect for each other's strength and courage, they became close friends, companions, brothers in all but blood. Together they had various adventures that form the bulk of the epic's middle sections, including a journey to the cedar forest to kill Humbaba, the monstrous guardian placed there by the gods to protect the sacred trees, and slaying the Bull of Heaven, a divine creature sent by the goddess Ishtar to punish Gilgamesh after he rejected her romantic and sexual advances, insulting her by recounting the terrible fates of her previous lovers. But when Enkidu died as divine punishment for these killings, condemned by the gods in council who decreed that one of the two friends must pay with his life for their offences against divine authority, Gilgamesh was absolutely devastated. For the first time in his life, this semi-divine king, this man who seemed invincible and beyond normal human concerns, confronted the reality of mortality in the most visceral, painful way possible. His friend, his companion, his equal, the one person who truly understood him, was dead and would not return. Gilgamesh watched Enkidu's body decay over 7 days, refusing to believe he was truly gone until a worm fell from the corpse's nose, undeniable proof that death was real and final. Gilgamesh spiraled into profound grief and existential terror that consumed him completely. If Enkidu could die, if his strength and vitality meant nothing against death's power, then Gilgamesh himself would one day die. The thought was unbearable, unacceptable, impossible to reconcile with his self-image. He abandoned his city, his throne, his responsibilities, and set out on a desperate quest to find immortality, seeking the one man who had achieved eternal life, Utnapishtim, the survivor of the great flood who had been granted immortality by the gods as a reward for preserving life during the catastrophe. The flood story embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh is actually an older independent tale, closely related to and probably derived from the Atrahasis epic we discussed earlier, inserted into the Gilgamesh narrative as Utnapishtim's explanation for how he became immortal, when Gilgamesh finally reached Utnapishtim after a long and arduous journey across impossible distances, passing through regions of total darkness, crossing waters of death, reaching the edge of the world where immortals dwell. The old man told him the story of how he became the only human ever granted eternal life. The gods, Utnapishtim explained, had decided to destroy humanity with a great flood, to wipe the earth clean of human life because their noise and overpopulation had become unbearable to Enlil. The decision was made in secret council, and all the gods swore oaths not to warn humanity of the coming catastrophe. But Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, the god of wisdom and sweet water, who had always shown some favour toward humanity, found a loophole in his oath. He couldn't tell a human directly, but he could speak to the reed walls of Utnapishtim's house, describing the coming flood in detail, while Utnapishtim happened to be inside listening. Ea warned him through this clever deception, telling him to build a boat, make it watertight and strong, load it with the seed of all living things, both animals and humans, and prepare to weather a storm unlike any the world had seen. Utnapishtim obeyed without hesitation, trusting the god's wisdom even though the instructions seemed bizarre. He constructed the vessel according to Ea's specifications, a massive cube-shaped ark 6 decks high, divided into compartments. When neighbours asked what he was doing, he told them the half-truths, saying that Enlil was angry with him personally, and had commanded him to leave the city and live by the water under Ea's protection, so he was building a boat for that purpose. It was a lie of a mission that kept people from panicking or demanding to be saved. When the boat was complete and the time came, Utnapishtim loaded it with his family, with craftsmen whose skills would be needed to rebuild civilization, with gold and silver and precious things, and with animals, male and female of every species he could capture or gather, ensuring that life in all its diversity could continue after the waters receded. As the loading was being completed and the last preparations made, the first signs of the coming storm appeared ominously. Adad, the storm god who controlled weather and rainfall, began to roar in the clouds with a sound like nothing heard before. Thunder rolled across the sky in continuous waves. Lightning flashed so constantly it seemed like daylight. The wind began to rise, howling with inhuman fury. Utnapishtim, sick with fear, his heart breaking at the thought of the coming destruction of everything and everyone he knew, sealed the door of the boat with bitumen, making it completely watertight, and prepared to endure whatever came. The flood began, and it was more terrible, more catastrophic, more absolutely devastating than anyone could have imagined in their worst nightmares. The text describes it with visceral, horrifying detail that suggests the poets had experienced or heard accounts of real catastrophic flooding. Like a wild ass screaming in terror and pain, the winds howled across the land with deafening volume. The darkness was total and absolute, like being buried alive, so complete that nothing could be seen at any distance. There was no sun, no moon, no stars, only blackness as thick as mud. People could not see each other in the darkness, not their families, not their children, not their neighbours. The flood swept over the land like an invading army, destroying everything in its path, showing no mercy, taking no prisoners. Cities that had stood for centuries were obliterated in hours. Fields that fed thousands were buried under surging water. Mountains disappeared beneath the rising deluge. Brother didn't see brother in the chaos and darkness. People were not recognized in the heavens or on earth, lost in the destroying water, swept away like insects. Even the gods, the powerful divine beings who had decreed this catastrophe, were terrified by what they had unleashed, shocked by the scale of destruction their decision had caused. They cowered like frightened dogs, crouching against the outer wall of heaven, watching in horror as the world they loved drowned beneath them. Ishtar, the great goddess of love and war, one of the most powerful deities in the pantheon, screamed like a woman in labour, her cries echoing across the heavens in anguish and regret. The lady of the gods, she whose voice is beautiful and whose words were always honey-sweet, was wailing in despair and self-recrimination. "The old days have turned to clay because I spoke evil in the assembly of the gods," she lamented. "How could I speak such evil in the assembly of the gods? How could I agree to command the destruction for my people who fill the sea like dead fish? I spoke for this catastrophe. I voted for this annihilation. The guilt is mine." The great mother goddess Nintu, who had created humanity in the first place, mixing divine blood with clay to form the first humans, wept bitter tears for her creations now drowning in the waters, calling out her sorrow and regret. The other gods wept with her, their lips encrusted with salt from dried tears and from the spray of the floodwaters, parched and famished because there were no offerings, no sacrifices being prepared, no food coming from the temples now buried beneath the waves. The text reveals something profound and deeply human here in the gods' reaction. They regretted their decision immediately upon seeing its consequences. They were horrified by the scale of destruction they had caused or allowed. They mourned for humanity, for their creations, for the cities and temples and civilizations now being swept away into oblivion. They hadn't fully understood what they were doing when they decreed the flood. They thought they were solving a problem, but they had created a far greater catastrophe, and more practically, more immediately, they were starving. Without humans to worship them, to prepare offerings, to maintain temples and make sacrifices, the gods had no sustenance. They depended on human worship more than they had realized, more than their pride had allowed them to acknowledge. The relationship was symbiotic, not one-directional. Gods needed humans as much as humans needed gods, perhaps even more. 7 days and 7 nights the flood raged without pause, without mercy, without relenting. The storm carried away everything that existed on the surface of the earth. Even the mountains were covered, their peaks disappearing beneath the rising waters. All land vanished. All life ceased. The world became one vast ocean with no shore, no land, no hope. Finally, on the 8th day, the winds began to calm. Their howling decreased to moaning, then to whispers, then to silence. The rain stopped falling. The waters, having reached their highest point, began to recede slowly. Utnapishtim's boat, which had been tossed on the waves like a leaf, came to rest on a mountain peak, grounding itself on the summit of Mount Nimush. Utnapishtim, having survived the darkness and the violence, having ridden out the storm that destroyed the world, opened a window and looked out at what remained. What he saw made him weep. The world had been scrubbed clean, silent and empty, all cities gone without a trace, all fields barren, all forests uprooted, humanity wiped away as if they had never existed. The silence was absolute and terrible, no voices calling, no animals crying, no wind through trees, just water and mud and death. Utnapishtim wept, tears flowing down his face as he looked at the complete and utter destruction, understanding that everything he had known was gone, that the world would have to be rebuilt from nothing, that countless innocent people, children and elders and everyone in between, had drowned in the darkness. But he was alive. His family was alive. The animals and seeds were safe in the boat's compartments. Life had survived the catastrophe. Civilization could continue. Humanity had a future, narrow as it was. Utnapishtim waited for the waters to recede further, watching day by day as more land appeared. When enough time had passed, he opened the door of the boat and set free a dove to search for dry land, to determine if anywhere was habitable yet. The dove flew out on swift wings, but found nowhere to perch, no tree, no dry ground, nothing but water stretching to every horizon. It returned to the boat, landing on Utnapishtim's outstretched hand, proof that the world was still flooded. He waited longer and tried again, this time sending a swallow to search more widely for dry land. The swallow also returned after some time, finding no place to land, indicating that habitable ground was still scarce. Finally, after more waiting, he sent a raven, a bird known for its intelligence and resourcefulness. The raven flew out and didn't return, having found a place to settle, likely feeding on corpses floating in the water or washed up on emerging mud banks. Its failure to return meant dry land was definitely appearing somewhere, that life could begin to re-establish itself on the barren earth. Utnapishtim and everyone on the boat, both human and animal, disembarked onto the muddy mountain peak, stepping onto solid ground for the first time in more than a week, grateful to be alive, awed by their survival, but also deeply aware of the magnitude of loss, of the world that had ended. The first thing Utnapishtim did, before eating, before resting, before anything else, was offer sacrifice to the gods, recognizing that they had survived by divine will, acknowledging the gods' power over life and death. He built an altar from stones gathered on the mountain. He slaughtered animals from among those he had saved. He burned aromatic woods, cedar and myrtle, creating smoke and fragrance. He prepared a feast as an offering, cooking meat and bread, pouring out beer and wine, giving the best of everything to the gods, who had been deprived of offerings for 7 terrible days. The gods smelled the smoke of the sacrifice rising into the sky. The text says they gathered like flies over the offering, swarming to it with desperate hunger, starving after 7 days without human worship, without the sustenance they drew from sacrificial offerings. They consumed the offerings eagerly, gratefully, like starving people attacking a feast. Ishtar arrived wearing a necklace of lapis lazuli flies that Anu, the sky god, had made for her as a gift, beautiful blue stones carved in the shape of flying insects. She swore by those flies, holding them up as physical testament to her oath that she would never forget these terrible days, never forget the cost of the flood, never forget how close they had come to destroying everything. Let all the gods come to the offering, she declared loudly so all could hear. Let them smell the sweet smoke and eat the prepared food, but let not Enlil come, because he thoughtlessly brought about this deluge, because he consigned my people to destruction without considering the consequences, because he nearly destroyed everything in his anger and impatience. But Enlil did come. Of course he came. He was the lord of earth and air, one of the supreme gods, and he wouldn't be excluded from anything. When he arrived and saw the boat grounded on the mountain, when he realized that some humans had survived the total annihilation he had decreed, he was absolutely furious. His face darkened with rage. His voice thundered with anger. No mortal was supposed to survive. The decision had been absolute, final, total. Humanity was to be completely wiped out, eliminated, erased from existence. Yet here was a boat full of living humans, animals prepared for breeding, seeds ready for planting, the entire foundation for repopulating the earth, ready to restart civilization as if the flood had been merely a setback rather than an ending. Enlil looked around at the other gods with rage burning in his eyes, demanding an explanation, an accounting for this betrayal. Who has done this? His voice shook the mountain. Which god helped humans survive? Who broke their oath? Who defied my decree? Who thought they knew better than me? Enki stepped forward calmly, meeting Enlil's rage with steady composure. He didn't deny his actions. He didn't apologize or make excuses. Yes, I warned Utnapishtim. I helped him understand what was coming. I gave him instructions to build the boat and save life from total destruction. And I was right to do so. We made a terrible mistake, and I corrected it before it became irreversible. Enki then made his argument, laying out the logic that Enlil's anger prevented him from seeing clearly. We created humans to serve us, to maintain our temples, to provide offerings and worship. They were made for a purpose, and that purpose benefits us directly. If we destroy them all completely, who will worship us? Who will maintain the temples we love? Who will provide the offerings we need? Who will sing our praises and tell our stories? We'll have peace and quiet, yes, but we'll also have emptiness and starvation. We depend on them. The flood proved that. 7 days without offerings, and we were gathered like desperate flies over Utnapishtim's sacrifice. Enki's words carried weight because the other gods had experienced the truth of what he said. They had starved during the flood. They had regretted their decision. They had mourned humanity even as they destroyed them. They knew Enki was right. Enlil, still angry but also recognizing the logic, reluctantly acknowledged that complete annihilation had been excessive, that perhaps a different solution was needed. Enki then proposed a compromise. a solution to the original problem that had led to this disaster in the first place. The problem that had made Enlil so angry he decreed genocide. The issue wasn't that humans existed. The issue wasn't human nature itself. The issue was that they multiplied too quickly, became too numerous, made too much noise, created too much chaos, became too difficult to manage effectively. The human population had grown beyond sustainable limits, and the gods had no mechanism for controlling it other than periodic mass death through plague, drought, or flood. So instead of destroying humanity periodically, when they became troublesome, why not limit their reproduction more permanently through natural means that wouldn't require divine intervention? Why not build population control into human nature itself? Enki and Nintu, the mother goddess who had originally created humanity, devised a new plan that would shape human biology and society going forward. From now on, not all women would be able to bear children as they had before. Some would be barren no matter what they did, unable to conceive despite health and youth and desire. This reduced the reproductive rate without requiring anyone to die violently. Demons would be created, dark spirits who would snatch away infants, causing miscarriages and infant mortality, ensuring that not every pregnancy resulted in a living child. This was cruel but effective, maintaining population limits through tragedy scattered throughout communities, rather than concentrated catastrophes. Additionally, certain categories of women dedicated to the gods as priestesses would be required to remain celibate, forbidden to marry or bear children, removing them entirely from the reproductive pool and ensuring their full dedication to temple service. This served religious purposes while also limiting population growth. Finally, human lifespans would be limited to a maximum of 120 years, instead of the much longer lives that people apparently enjoyed before the flood, when patriarchs lived for centuries according to legend. Shorter lives meant less accumulated wisdom, less individual impact, and faster generational turnover, keeping human society more manageable. These measures, Enki argued, would keep the human population at a level the gods could comfortably manage without requiring periodic genocides, plagues, or floods. People would still die, but gradually, naturally, through processes built into human biology, rather than through catastrophic divine intervention. Enlil, seeing the wisdom in this compromise, recognizing that it addressed his concerns while preserving humanity's existence and usefulness, agreed to the new arrangement. The gods made their peace with each other and with humanity's continued existence. The crisis was resolved through negotiation and restructuring rather than through complete destruction. Utnapishtim himself was rewarded for his righteousness, for his obedience to divine instruction, for his role in preserving life through the catastrophe. He and his wife were granted immortality as a special divine gift, a unique reward that would never be repeated. They were sent to live at Dilmun, a paradise at the edge of the world, a place beyond normal geography where immortal beings could dwell in peace and plenty. There they would stay forever, ageless and deathless, honoured as the only humans ever granted such a gift. This is the Atrahasis epic in its full glory, the most complete Sumerian account of creation and the flood, a narrative that explains human origins, purpose and limitations within Sumerian theological framework. It's the story that Zecharia Sitchin and other ancient astronaut theorists point to as supposed evidence of alien genetic engineering, extraterrestrial visitors, and advanced technology. But look closely, really closely, at what the text actually says when read honestly without imposing modern science fiction concepts onto ancient religious literature. The gods created humans by mixing divine blood from a sacrifice god with clay from the earth through a magical ritual performed by a goddess using divine powers and sacred incantations. There's no description of laboratories or test tubes or DNA sequencing or genetic manipulation or any scientific processes whatsoever. The language is explicitly, unambiguously mythological in every detail. Divine essence, which exists in blood, combined with earthly matter, represented by clay, through sacred ritual performed by a deity with inherent divine creative power, animated by divine will expressed through spoken incantation and blessing. This is creation through magic in the purest sense, through supernatural divine action, not through technology or biology or any naturalistic process. This is how every ancient culture described creation, through divine action that transcended natural law. The gods created humans to do labor, absolutely yes. But what kind of labor? Agricultural labor in the river valleys of Mesopotamia? They needed workers to dig irrigation canals to bring water to fields, to maintain the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that were Mesopotamia's lifeblood, to plough fields and plant crops, to harvest grain and process it into food, to tend orchards and gardens, to build and maintain cities, to perform all the agricultural and infrastructural work necessary to support urban civilization in a river valley environment. The text is very specific about this. It describes canal digging, river maintenance, field work, agricultural production. There's absolutely no mention anywhere of mines or mining operations, no discussion of gold extraction or refinement, no description of underground tunnels or mining equipment or ore processing. The claim that Anunnaki came to Earth to mine gold appears nowhere in this text, nowhere in the Atrahasis, nowhere in any other authentic Sumerian source from ancient Mesopotamia. The rebellion that led to human creation was a labor dispute among gods who were divine beings frustrated with menial work. It was not a mutiny of alien workers on a distant planet or in ancient Earth colonies. The language describes divine beings explicitly, children of heaven and earth, members of the cosmic pantheon, not extraterrestrials or astronauts or visitors from another star system. They're part of the cosmic hierarchy as Sumerian religion understood it, serving under supreme gods like Anu and Enlil, following divine law, participating in divine councils, interacting as gods interact in all ancient Near Eastern religions. The flood was sent because humans were too noisy, too numerous, too disorderly, creating too much chaos for the gods to tolerate comfortably. It was not sent because the gods wanted to eliminate failed genetic experiments or cover up evidence of alien intervention, or destroy humans who had outlived their usefulness to an alien mining operation. The text is absolutely explicit about the motivation: noise, overpopulation, disruption of divine peace. These are concerns about managing a large human population from the perspective of gods who live among humans in temple cities, not concerns of technologically advanced aliens conducting biological experiments. The gods regretted the flood immediately, mourned for humanity while they were drowning, were frightened by the destruction they had unleashed, wept for the world they had destroyed, and depended on human worship for their own sustenance, gathering like starving flies over Utnapishtim's sacrifice after 7 days without offerings. These are characteristics of gods as traditionally understood in ancient religions throughout the world, deities who are powerful but also vulnerable, who need worship and devotion, who make mistakes and feel regret, who depend on humans even while humans depend on them. These are not characteristics we would associate with advanced aliens conducting scientific experiments. They're characteristics of divine beings in religious mythology. The resolution involved magical solutions decreed by divine will, creating demons through divine power, imposing fertility limits through supernatural intervention, shortening lifespans through divine decree rather than genetic reprogramming. Again, this is mythology operating in a mythological mode, using supernatural divine action to explain natural phenomena like infant mortality and human lifespan limits. This is not aliens using technology to adjust human biology. This is gods using divine power to restructure human nature. When we read the Atrahasis honestly, respecting its genre and cultural context, understanding it as what it is, rather than trying to force it to be something it isn't, we find a sophisticated creation myth explaining human origins and purpose within Sumerian theology. We find gods who are powerful but flawed, capable but limited, who make mistakes but can also show wisdom, who can be cruel but also compassionate, who depend on humans as much as humans depend on them in a relationship that's symbiotic and complex. We find theological explanations for why humans must work, why women sometimes can't conceive, why infants sometimes die, why people age and eventually die rather than living forever. We don't find aliens. We don't find genetic engineering. We don't find gold mining. We don't find technology or science or extraterrestrial visitors. We find exactly what Sumerian culture produced through their religious imagination and literary skill: mythological narratives explaining existence, human purpose, and cosmic order through the lens of their religious beliefs and social structures, creating meaningful stories that address the deepest questions of human existence using the conceptual tools their culture provided. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that describes the origins of the cosmos and the rise of Marduk to supreme authority among the gods, provides yet another perspective on cosmic origins and the role of the Anunnaki in maintaining universal order. Though this text was composed later than purely Sumerian works, around 1200 years before the Common Era during the Babylonian period, and comes from Babylon rather than from the earlier Sumerian city-states, it preserves older traditions and was written in Akkadian, a Semitic language that used cuneiform script borrowed from the Sumerians and adapted for different linguistic purposes. The Enuma Elish, whose title means when on high in Akkadian, taken from the opening words of the text in a tradition common to ancient Near Eastern literature, tells the story of creation beginning with the primordial waters before anything else existed. In the beginning, only two beings existed in the darkness before creation: Apsu, representing fresh water, the sweet water of rivers and underground springs that Mesopotamians depended on for life, and Tiamat, representing salt water, the bitter water of the sea. They were the first couple, the original parents, the source of everything that would come into being. From their mingling, from the mixing of fresh and salt water in the marshes and estuaries, where the Tigris and Euphrates met the sea, the first gods emerged through a process of divine generation that the text describes as natural and inevitable. These younger gods, the children and grandchildren of the primordial couple, were energetic and noisy, full of activity and movement, constantly doing things, making sounds, creating disturbance. They disturbed Apsu's rest with their constant activity and endless noise, disrupting his peace. The theme repeats again here as it did in the Atrahasis. Noise bothers the older, more established powers who want peace and stillness. Apsu complained bitterly to Tiamat about their offspring. "These gods we created together are unbearable. I cannot endure them any longer. By day I cannot rest because of their activities. By night I cannot sleep because of their noise. They have made my existence miserable. I will destroy them and return everything to peaceful silence, to the way things were before they existed, when there was only stillness and darkness and rest." Tiamat was shocked by this proposal, horrified that Apsu would even consider such an action. How can we destroy what we ourselves created? They are our children, our descendants. How can a parent kill their offspring? What kind of cruelty is that? But Apsu was determined, unmoved by her arguments, resolved to eliminate the source of his discomfort regardless of the moral implications. He began plotting the destruction of his own children, seeking ways to annihilate them without them discovering his intentions first. His counselor and servant Mumu encouraged this murderous plan, perhaps out of loyalty to Apsu, or perhaps because he too found the younger gods troublesome and wanted them gone. The younger gods learned of the threat through various means, perhaps through Tiamat, who warned them of Apsu's intentions out of maternal concern, or perhaps through their own divine awareness of cosmic events. They panicked, not knowing how to respond to this existential threat. How could they fight their own father, the primordial source of their existence? How could they survive against the being who created them? They gathered in council, arguing, debating, seeking solutions, but finding no good options. Fear paralyzed them. But Ea, the Akkadian form of Enki, the clever god of wisdom who always found solutions where others saw only problems, acted decisively when others hesitated. He used powerful magic, ancient incantations known only to him, to put Apsu into a deep, enchanted sleep, a supernatural slumber from which normal means could not wake him. While Apsu slept helplessly, unaware and undefended, Ea killed him, ending the threat permanently. He then claimed Apsu's dwelling place, the cosmic freshwater ocean beneath the earth that was the source of all rivers and springs, as his own domain, establishing himself there as lord over the sweet waters. This act of patricide, of a son killing his father, established Ea as a major power among the gods, proving his courage, his cleverness, his willingness to do what was necessary for survival. In his newly claimed realm, in the cosmic deep that had been Apsu's home, Ea and his wife Damkina had a son, Marduk, who would become the hero of this epic and the supreme god of Babylon. Marduk was extraordinary from the moment of his birth, described as perfect in every way that mattered. He had 4 eyes, 2 facing forward and 2 facing backward, allowing him to see in all directions simultaneously, to perceive everything without blind spots. He had 4 ears, 2 on each side, enabling him to hear everything from every direction, to perceive all sounds throughout the cosmos. He was larger and stronger than any god born before him. He radiated divine glory so bright it was painful to look at him directly. From the beginning, Ea knew his son was destined for greatness, marked for supreme authority. Meanwhile, in another part of the cosmos, Tiamat brooded over the death of her consort, consumed with grief and anger. She had warned Apsu not to attack their children. She had argued against his plan. But now he was dead, killed by their own offspring, and she was alone. The other gods, those who had sympathized with Apsu's complaints about the younger generation's noise, urged her to avenge him, to punish those who had killed him, to show that such patricide could not go unpunished. Eventually, after much persuasion and her own growing rage, she agreed to make war against the gods who had killed her mate. She created an army of monsters unlike anything that had existed before, drawing on her primordial power to generate new forms of life specifically designed for war and destruction. Serpents with razor-sharp teeth and venomous fangs, dragons filled with deadly poison, breathing fire and death, storm demons that brought chaos wherever they went, fishmen combining the worst aspects of aquatic and terrestrial life, bullmen with incredible strength and savage ferocity, scorpion men with stinging tails and armored bodies, an army of nightmares made real, each creature a weapon designed to kill gods. She placed Kingu, one of the gods who supported her cause and who had perhaps become her new consort, at the head of this monstrous army as its commander and general. She gave him the Tablet of Destinies, a divine object of supreme power that granted its bearer authority over fate itself, the power to decree what would happen and make it come to pass. With the Tablet of Destinies, King's commands became reality, his strategies became inevitable, his will became cosmic law. The younger gods, facing this terrifying army led by their own mother, the primordial mother of all gods, armed with weapons of divine authority, were absolutely terrified. They held council after council, debating what to do, how to respond, whether resistance was even possible. They needed a champion to face Tiamat in single combat, a warrior strong enough and brave enough to challenge the primordial chaos itself. They approached several candidates, gods known for their strength or courage or skill in battle, but none would accept the challenge. The risk was too great, the odds of victory too slim. Tiamat was primal chaos personified, the original mother, the source of all existence. Who could fight that and hope to win? Finally they approached Marduk, the young god who had shown such promise, who radiated divine power, who seemed marked for special destiny. Would you fight Tiamat on our behalf? Would you face the primordial chaos and defend us against her army of monsters? Marduk agreed, showing no fear, confident in his own power, but he was also clever like his father Ea. He named his price for this service, and it was high. If I defeat Tiamat and save you all from destruction, if I face the mother of gods and emerge victorious, if I risk my existence for yours, then you must make me supreme king of all the gods. My word must become law that none can challenge. Whatever I decree must come to pass without question. I must have absolute authority over all divine affairs. You must bow to me as supreme lord. The gods, desperate and seeing no other option, agreed to his terms without negotiation. They held a formal assembly, drew up divine contracts, swore binding oaths, and granted Marduk the authority he demanded. They gave him kingship over the entire divine realm, conditional on his victory but permanent once achieved. Marduk armed himself with powerful weapons collected from throughout the cosmos, a great bow, arrows that flew true, a mace of divine metal, lightning bolts he could throw like spears, and a huge net woven from cosmic threads that could capture anything. He created 7 evil winds to aid him in battle, supernatural forces that obeyed his command absolutely. Then, fully prepared and absolutely confident, he went forth to face Tiamat in single combat that would determine the fate of all existence. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat is described in the Enuma Elish, with vivid, violent detail that emphasizes both the physical conflict and the cosmic significance. They confronted each other on the field of battle, Marduk young and strong and shining with divine glory, Tiamat ancient and terrible and embodying primordial chaos. They traded insults and accusations, each listing the crimes and faults of the other, engaging in ritual combat boasting that was common in ancient Near Eastern warfare narratives. Then they fought, and the cosmos shook with the violence of their conflict. Marduk cast his net, throwing it with perfect accuracy. The net spread in the air and caught Tiamat, entangling her massive form. She struggled against it, thrashing and roaring, but the net was woven from cosmic threads that could not be broken. While she was tangled and constrained, Marduk sent the 7 evil winds he had created toward her. When Tiamat opened her enormous jaws to swallow the winds or breathe fire at Marduk, the winds rushed into her mouth, down her throat, filling her from within. She became bloated with the evil winds trapped inside her, swollen and helpless, unable to close her mouth or defend herself properly. Marduk seized this moment of vulnerability. He shot an arrow with his great bow, aiming perfectly. The arrow flew true and pierced through Tiamat's open mouth, down her throat, through her internal organs, and struck her heart, killing the primordial mother of gods instantly. Tiamat collapsed, lifeless, chaos defeated by order, primordial power overcome by younger divine authority. With Tiamat dead, Marduk turned his attention to her army of monsters and supporting gods. They tried to flee, scattering in all directions, but Marduk was faster and more powerful than any of them. He captured them all systematically, rounding up monsters and gods alike, taking prisoners. He captured Kingu, who had commanded Tiamat's forces and worn the Tablet of Destinies. Marduk removed the tablet from Kingu and fastened it to his own chest with divine bindings, claiming ultimate authority over fate itself. With the Tablet of Destinies, Marduk's commands became reality, his decrees became inevitable, his will became cosmic law that none could resist. Now came the act of creation, the fashioning of the ordered cosmos from the body of defeated chaos. Marduk approached Tiamat's enormous corpse, considering what to do with it. He split her body in half lengthwise, dividing her like opening a shellfish, separating top from bottom. From one half of her body he fashioned the dome of heaven, creating the sky that arched over everything, solid and firm, keeping the cosmic waters above from flooding down. From the other half he created the earth, the solid ground where life would dwell, stable and reliable, keeping the cosmic waters below from surging up. He used parts of her body to create other features of the cosmos. He set the stars in their places across the heavens, organizing them into constellations, assigning them meanings and associations. He established the calendar, assigning the months and seasons, creating cyclical time from timeless chaos. He set the paths of the planets across the sky, those wandering stars that moved against the fixed constellations. He created the Euphrates and Tigris rivers from her eyes, those weeping tears that would water Mesopotamia forever. From her breasts he made mountains, those sources of water and life. From other parts of her body he fashioned other elements of creation, organizing everything, imposing structure and order on what had been chaos. He organized the entire cosmos according to rational principles, giving each god a specific station and assigned duties. Some gods would govern the movements of celestial bodies, maintaining the order of the heavens. Others would manage weather and seasons, ensuring regular patterns of rain and sun. Still others would oversee the earth's fertility, rivers, agriculture, and human affairs. Everything was assigned, organized, structured. But despite this cosmic organization, gods still needed workers to maintain the physical world, to build and maintain temples, to provide offerings and worship. The gods were exhausted from battle and from the work of creation. They wanted to rest, to enjoy their divine status, not to labor maintaining the world. So Marduk proposed creating humanity to serve the gods as they had been created in the Atrahasis, but he would create them from the ringleader of the rebellion, making an example of him. Marduk consulted with his father Ea, the god of wisdom, about the method of creation. Which of Tiamat's allies should be sacrificed to create humanity? They investigated and held divine trials, examining which god bore the most guilt for inciting Tiamat to war. They determined that King was most responsible. He had encouraged Tiamat's war. He had accepted command of her army. He had worn the Tablet of Destinies and led forces against the gods. He was guilty of cosmic rebellion, and the punishment would be death and transformation. King was executed in a ritual sacrifice before the assembled gods. His divine blood spilled for creative purposes. From his blood, which contained divine essence and intelligence, Ea created humanity using techniques similar to those described in the Atrahasis. Divine blood mixed with earthly clay, shaped and formed, animated by divine will and creative power. The text says explicitly, from his blood they created mankind. The gods imposed labor on humans so that the gods themselves could be at leisure, so divine beings could rest and be served rather than working themselves. Humanity was created with a purpose, to maintain the world, to build temples, to provide offerings, to worship the gods and sustain them through devotion. The Enuma Elish then describes Marduk assigning the Anunnaki their roles in the newly organized cosmos. The gods of heaven and underworld, 600 in total according to the text, assembled to honor Marduk and receive their assignments. He assigned 300 Anunnaki to guard the heavens, to maintain cosmic order above, to ensure the celestial mechanisms functioned properly. He assigned another 300 to guard the underworld, to maintain order below, to ensure the realm of the dead operated according to divine law. Each group had specific duties in maintaining cosmic order, ensuring the universe Marduk had created from Tiamat's body continued functioning properly. The gods, grateful for Marduk's victory that had saved them from destruction, grateful for the creation of humans who would relieve them of labor, grateful for the organization of the cosmos that gave each deity a proper role and status, built Marduk a magnificent temple in Babylon. They constructed it as a thank offering and as an acknowledgement of his supreme authority. The temple, called Isargala, would serve as Marduk's dwelling place and the center of his worship, the most important religious structure in Babylon, the axis mundi connecting heaven and earth. The epic ends with a recitation of Marduk's 50 names, each representing a different aspect of his power and authority, each acknowledging a different dimension of his supreme status over all other gods. The names include Asarlui, Asaru, Namtilaku, Tutu, and many others, each with elaborate explanations of what that name signifies about Marduk's character, power, and role in the cosmos. This litany of names serves both religious and political purposes, reinforcing Marduk's supremacy theologically, while also reinforcing Babylon's supremacy politically, as the city whose patron god ruled all others. The Enuma Elish reveals several important things about Mesopotamian religion and the Anunnaki's place in it. When we read it as religious literature, rather than trying to force it into a scientific framework, it was never meant to occupy. First, cosmic order emerged from violence and conflict, not from peaceful cooperation or divine plan. Creation came from Tiamat's violent death, from her body being split and reformed. Authority was established through combat and victory, not through inherent right or democratic process. This reflects the political reality of ancient Mesopotamia, where power often came through conquest, and where kingdoms rose and fell through warfare. The myth validates and explains political violence by mirroring it in cosmic events. Second, younger gods overthrew older ones in a pattern that appears throughout world mythology. Marduk's generation defeated Tiamat's generation. The children overcame the parents. Authority transferred from the primordial creators to their descendants, who proved stronger and more capable. This pattern may reflect generational changes in actual society, as well as changes in which gods were most important to different cultures at different times. As cities rose and fell in Mesopotamia, their patron god's importance changed, and myths reflected those shifts. The Enuma Elish was essentially Babylonian propaganda, elevating Marduk, Babylon's patron god, to supreme status over all others, including older Sumerian deities who had previously been considered supreme. Third, humanity was created as an afterthought, not as the center or purpose of creation, but as a practical solution to divine labor shortage. We're not the focus of the story, we're barely mentioned. We exist to serve the gods, to maintain temples and provide offerings. Our purpose is service, and that service benefits the gods directly, sustaining them and freeing them from labor. This is characteristic of Mesopotamian religion, which saw humans as servants of the gods rather than as children of the gods, or as beings with inherent worth independent of divine service. Fourth, the Anunnaki are assigned roles by Marduk after his victory. They're not independent entities who arrive from elsewhere. They're part of the divine hierarchy with clear authority structures. They serve the supreme god, carrying out his will, maintaining the cosmic order he established through victory over chaos. They're administrators and guardians, divine bureaucrats ensuring everything functions according to Marduk's design. Fifth, and this is crucial for understanding why Sitchin's interpretation is completely wrong, the entire myth operates in a mode where physical forces and elements are personified as gods, and creation happens through divine action employing divine power, not through technological or natural processes. Tiamat isn't an actual biological creature that was literally split in half. She's not a dinosaur or a dragon that Marduk fought with swords and arrows. She's a personification of the primordial chaos, the formless salt waters that existed before creation imposed order. Her defeat represents the imposition of order on chaos, structure on formlessness, cosmos on void. This is mythology operating in its proper mode, using narrative, characters and action to explain cosmic realities through symbolic story. When Sitchin and others claim the Enuma Elish describes planetary collisions, celestial mechanics, and the formation of the solar system through cosmic impacts, they're imposing a modern scientific framework onto a text that was never meant to operate that way, that was created in a cultural context that had completely different ways of understanding and explaining the world. Yes, if you're determined to force the interpretation, if you ignore the actual language and cultural context, if you treat poetic religious metaphor as if it were scientific description, you can claim that Tiamat represents a planet that was destroyed in a cosmic collision, that Marduk represents another planetary body or celestial object that collided with it, that the creation of heaven and Earth from her body represents the formation of Earth, and the asteroid belt from planetary debris following an ancient impact event. But this interpretation requires systematically ignoring the actual language, dismissing the genre, rejecting the cultural context and disregarding the explicit statements about what these beings are and what is happening. The text says Tiamat is the salt water personified, not a planet. It says she's the mother of gods, not a wandering celestial body. It says Marduk is a god born from other gods through divine generation, not an astronomical object. It describes creation through divine combat employing supernatural weapons and divine will, not through natural physical processes governed by gravity and momentum. The text tells us repeatedly, in language that's clear if we listen honestly, that this is mythology, religious narrative, theological explanation, not astronomy or planetary science disguised as poetry. Forcing modern astronomical theories onto ancient mythology doesn't reveal hidden knowledge that ancient peoples possessed. It doesn't decode secret scientific information encoded in religious texts. It distorts the text beyond recognition and prevents us from understanding what it actually meant to the people who composed it, recited it, and heard it in temples and palaces throughout Mesopotamia for thousands of years. The Enuma Elish is theology, not astronomy. It's a religious text explaining cosmic origins through mythological narrative, justifying Marduk's supremacy theologically, accounting for the structure of the universe as Babylonians understood it, defining humanity's purpose and place, and reinforcing Babylon's political authority by making their patron god supreme over all others. It does this through mythological narrative, using gods as characters, violence as plot, divine decree as mechanism, and poetic language as medium. That's what mythology is and how it functions across all human cultures. The Anunnaki in this text are divine administrators, guards of heaven and underworld assigned positions by Marduk, servants of the supreme god maintaining cosmic order. They're not aliens, they're not astronauts, they're not extraterrestrial genetic engineers. They're gods, divine beings, serving specific functions within Babylonian religious cosmology, maintaining the ordered universe that Marduk created from primordial chaos. Now, we must directly address the modern distortions that have twisted authentic Sumerian and Babylonian mythology into pseudo-historical claims about ancient astronauts and extraterrestrial genetic engineering. How did legitimate religious texts about divine judges and cosmic order become corrupted into tales of aliens mining gold and manipulating human DNA? The transformation didn't happen in ancient times. It's entirely modern, beginning in the 20th century with the rise of pseudo-archaeology and ancient astronaut theories. The story begins with Erich von Däniken and his influential book Chariots of the Gods, published in 1968 during a period of intense public interest in UFOs, space exploration, and countercultural challenges to traditional authority. Von Däniken didn't focus specifically on the Anunnaki or Sumerian texts in detail, but he established the conceptual framework that would enable later writers to reinterpret ancient texts and artifacts through an extraterrestrial lens. His central claim was audacious and captured public imagination. Many ancient religious texts, archaeological sites, and unexplained artifacts could be better explained as evidence of extraterrestrial visitation in humanity's distant past than through conventional historical and archaeological interpretations. He argued that ancient peoples lacked the technological capability and intellectual sophistication to build impressive structures like the pyramids of Egypt, the statues of Easter Island, or the lines of Nazca on their own, so aliens must have either built these structures themselves or provided the knowledge and technology necessary for humans to build them. He reinterpreted religious texts from various cultures as confused accounts of technological encounters that primitive people misunderstood and mythologized, turning advanced aliens into gods simply because they lacked proper categories to understand what they were seeing. He claimed that descriptions of gods were actually descriptions of extraterrestrial visitors, that divine powers were misunderstood advanced technology, that creation myths encoded race memories of genetic engineering, that religious art depicted spacecraft and technology. The framework was fundamentally pseudo-archaeological, based on systematically misrepresenting evidence, ignoring inconvenient facts, cherry-picking data, and making assumptions that experts in the relevant fields universally rejected as nonsense. But despite being thoroughly debunked by archaeologists, historians, engineers, and scholars from multiple relevant disciplines, von Däniken's books proved immensely popular with general audiences who found his claims exciting and appealing. Chariots of the Gods sold millions of copies worldwide and spawned numerous sequels, imitators, and an entire genre of ancient astronaut literature that continues to this day. Why was it so popular despite being wrong? Multiple factors contributed to its success. The space age was exciting, and the idea that ancient humans had encountered aliens made both ancient history and space exploration seem more connected and relevant. Distrust of established authorities made people receptive to alternative explanations that challenged expert consensus. The claims were presented as if they were scientific and evidence-based, using photographs, diagrams, and technical-sounding language that gave them false credibility. And fundamentally, the stories were more exciting than conventional history, offering mystery, conspiracy, and cosmic significance rather than the patient accumulation of knowledge through careful research. Then came Zecharia Sitchin, who took von Däniken's framework and applied it specifically and systematically to Sumerian and Babylonian texts with claims of linguistic expertise that gave his work a veneer of scholarly credibility it didn't deserve. In 1976, Sitchin published The 12th Planet, the first in his Earth Chronicles series that would eventually total 13 books, elaborating his theories in exhaustive detail. Sitchin claimed expertise in reading Sumerian cuneiform tablets and Akkadian texts, though he had no formal training in Assyriology, no degree in ancient languages, no academic credentials in the relevant fields. He was an independent scholar, self-taught in languages notoriously difficult to master, claiming to have discovered the true meaning of Sumerian texts that professional scholars had supposedly missed or deliberately suppressed. According to Sitchin's interpretation, which he supported with selective quotations, creative translations, and elaborate constructions connecting various myths into a single coherent narrative, the Sumerian tablets told a completely different story than anyone had realized. The Anunnaki weren't gods in any traditional religious sense. They were aliens, extraterrestrial beings, humanoid visitors from a distant planet in our own solar system. This planet, which Sitchin called Nibiru, was supposedly a 12th planet in the solar system, if you counted the Sun and Moon as planets in the ancient manner. Nibiru travelled in a highly elliptical orbit, approaching the inner solar system only once every 3,600 years before swinging back out to the distant reaches beyond Pluto. Approximately 450,000 years ago, according to Sitchin's chronology, during one of Nibiru's periodic approaches to the inner solar system, the Anunnaki came to Earth from their home planet. They were technologically advanced beings, far beyond current human capabilities, who needed gold desperately to repair their planet's deteriorating atmosphere, which was leaking into space and threatening their civilization with extinction. They established mining operations on Earth, particularly in Africa where rich gold deposits existed near the surface, and began extracting the precious metal to transport back to Nibiru, where it would somehow be used to restore their atmospheric shield. But the mining work was brutal, dangerous, and exhausting. After 3,600 years of continuous mining operations, roughly the time it took for Nibiru to complete one orbit and return, the Anunnaki workers labouring in the mines rebelled against their leaders in the royal family and scientific elite, who lived comfortably while workers suffered. They refused to continue the brutal labour, demanding better conditions or an alternative solution. Facing a complete breakdown of their operations and unable to force their own people back to work without risking civil war, the Anunnaki leadership desperately needed a solution. This is where Enki enters Sitchin's narrative as the chief scientist and genetic engineer, the brilliant researcher who proposed creating a slave species to replace Anunnaki workers in the mines. Enki, according to Sitchin, conducted genetic experiments combining Anunnaki DNA with that of Homo erectus, a primitive hominid already living on Earth, creating a hybrid through in vitro fertilization and artificial gestation. The result was modern humans, Homo sapiens, created specifically to be a slave species engineered to mine gold for the Anunnaki. We were literally made to be servants, our intelligence just sufficient for following orders and performing labour, but not enough to threaten our creators. Sitchin claimed that all of Sumerian mythology was actually a literal historical record of these events, decoded properly. The creation myths describe genetic engineering procedures. The descriptions of gods fashioning humans from clay were primitive attempts to describe test tubes and laboratory equipment. The flood story described the Anunnaki's attempt to wipe out their human creations when we became too numerous or too troublesome. The ziggurats and temples were actually spaceports and landing platforms. The gods' divine vehicles described in various texts were spacecraft. Divine symbols like the winged disc were technological devices. Every myth, every story, every image could be reinterpreted through this alien lens if you were creative enough with your interpretations and willing to ignore any evidence that didn't fit. Sitchin produced 13 books over several decades elaborating this theory in tremendous detail, creating an elaborate alternative history of humanity spanning hundreds of thousands of years. He analysed cylinder seals, claiming they showed accurate maps of the solar system including Nibiru. He reinterpreted ancient artwork as depictions of aliens, spacecraft, and advanced technology. He retranslated Sumerian and Akkadian texts to fit his narrative, changing words, ignoring grammar, creating new etymologies. He connected myths from different periods and places into a single grand narrative. His books sold millions of copies worldwide, were translated into dozens of languages, launched an entire genre of ancient astronaut literature specifically focused on the Anunnaki, and influenced countless people's understanding of ancient Mesopotamia, including inspiring television shows, documentaries, novels, and online communities dedicated to exploring his ideas. The problem, and it's an absolutely massive foundational problem that undermines everything Sitchin built, is that virtually everything he claimed was demonstrably, provably wrong. Not wrong in the sense of being debatable or open to interpretation, or subject to scholarly disagreement over fine points. Wrong in the sense that his translations were wrong, his interpretations of symbols and artwork were wrong, his astronomical claims were wrong, his understanding of ancient cultures was wrong, and his methodology was wrong. This isn't scholars being closed-minded or defending orthodoxy or refusing to consider alternative ideas. This is that Sitchin's entire framework collapses completely when examined by people who actually know the languages, archaeology, and science involved. Let's address the specific problems systematically and thoroughly, because this is genuinely important. People who encounter Sitchin's work deserve to know why experts reject these claims universally, and the reasons are compelling and conclusive. First and most fundamentally, Sitchin's translations are wrong. He claimed to read Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform accurately, but his translations consistently don't match what the texts actually say. This isn't a matter of differing interpretations of ambiguous passages. This is that he mistranslated words, ignored grammar, invented etymologies, and produced English versions that bear little resemblance to what scholars who actually study these languages professionally find in the same texts. Take the word Anunnaki itself as a clear example. Sitchin translated it as those who from heaven to earth came, suggesting extraterrestrial origin directly in the name, but this translation has absolutely no basis whatsoever in Sumerian grammar, vocabulary, or etymology. The word Anunnaki comes from Sumerian linguistic roots that are well documented and understood by scholars who have studied these languages for over a century. It derives from Anu or An, the name of the sky god who was supreme in the early Sumerian pantheon, combined with elements meaning offspring, descendants, or those of royal blood. The word literally refers to the princely offspring of An, the children or descendants of the sky god, indicating their divine status and high rank in the heavenly hierarchy. Every Sumerian dictionary, every scholarly lexicon, every academic translation produced by people who actually know the language agrees on this basic derivation and meaning. There's no ambiguity here, no scholarly debate, no competing interpretations among actual experts. Sitchin made up his own translation with no linguistic foundation whatsoever, and presented it as if it were fact, as if he had uncovered something scholars had missed. But he didn't miss anything except proper training in the language. His translation, Those Who From Heaven to Earth Came, requires breaking Sumerian grammar rules, inventing word meanings that don't exist in any lexicon, and ignoring the actual etymological roots that scholars have traced through thousands of texts. It's not just wrong, it's completely fabricated. Dr. Michael Heiser, who holds a doctorate in Hebrew Bible and ancient Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, has extensively and systematically critiqued Sitchin's work in detail, demonstrating error after error after error. Heiser is genuinely fluent in ancient languages including Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Ugaritic, and several others relevant to ancient Near Eastern studies. He studied Sumerian and Akkadian formally, and can actually read the cuneiform tablets in their original languages without relying on translations. He's not approaching this as a skeptic with an agenda. He's approaching it as a scholar who can verify claims directly by reading the primary sources. He's examined Sitchin's translations line by line, comparing them to what the texts actually say, and found error after error after error throughout Sitchin's work. In one comprehensive analysis, Heiser went to the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, a comprehensive online database maintained by Oxford University that contains virtually every known Sumerian literary text that has been recovered, translated, and published. This database is freely available to anyone with internet access. Anyone can check these texts. It contains the actual texts with scholarly translations that represent the consensus understanding of hundreds of experts who have dedicated their careers to understanding these languages. Heiser systematically searched for every instance of the word Anunnaki in this massive corpus, examining each occurrence in its full context to understand how the word was actually used in Sumerian literature. His conclusion after examining every single reference was absolutely unambiguous and thoroughly documented. The Anunnaki appear consistently as deities, as members of the divine pantheon, as judges in the underworld passing sentences on the dead, as gods assigned specific cosmic duties by higher-ranking gods like Marduk or Enlil. They never appear as aliens or extraterrestrial visitors. They're never described as coming from another planet or arriving from space. They're never said to mine gold or establish mining operations of any kind. They're never credited with genetic engineering or creating humans through technological means. They're gods, full stop, described in ways entirely consistent with how every ancient Near Eastern culture described their deities, with powers and limitations appropriate to mythological divine beings rather than to technologically advanced aliens. Sitchin's version of the Anunnaki, the gold-mining aliens from planet Nibiru conducting genetic experiments, appears absolutely nowhere in actual Sumerian literature. It doesn't exist in the texts. Sitchin invented it by mistranslating, misinterpreting, connecting unrelated passages, and filling in gaps with pure speculation presented as if it were translation. Second major problem: the planet Nibiru as Sitchin described it. He built his entire theory around this supposed 12th planet, with its 3,600-year elliptical orbit, claiming it was humanity's hidden origin, the home of the Anunnaki and a celestial body known to ancient Mesopotamians but forgotten by modern astronomy. But Nibiru in actual Mesopotamian texts doesn't mean what Sitchin claimed at all. Heiser analysed every cuneiform text mentioning Nibiru, using primary sources and standard scholarly lexicons that compile how words are used across thousands of texts. He found that Nibiru was used in astronomical and religious contexts to refer to several different celestial objects at different times and places, but never to a distant planet with a millennial orbit. The word Nibiru appears most commonly referring to Jupiter, the largest planet visible to ancient observers and one of the most important celestial bodies in Mesopotamian astronomy and astrology. Occasionally it referred to Mercury, the swift planet close to the Sun. It was associated with the god Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, who was himself associated with Jupiter in astronomical texts. Sometimes it referred to a star, likely the pole star or another reference star used for navigation and timekeeping. The word Nibiru itself meant crossing or crossing point, probably referring to significant astronomical positions like equinoxes where the ecliptic crosses the celestial equator, or other important points in the sky used for calendrical calculations. What Nibiru never meant in any authentic ancient text was a 12th planet beyond Pluto, with a multi-thousand-year orbit visiting the inner solar system periodically. The Sumerians and Babylonians, according to their own preserved astronomical records that we can still read today, knew of exactly 5 planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. They observed and tracked these planets very carefully over many centuries. They created sophisticated astronomical tablets recording planetary positions and movements. They could predict eclipses with impressive accuracy. They developed mathematical methods for calculating celestial phenomena. Their astronomical knowledge was genuinely impressive for naked eye observation without telescopes or electronic instruments. But they did not and could not have telescopes to see beyond Saturn. They had no knowledge of Uranus, discovered in 1781. They had no knowledge of Neptune, discovered in 1846. They had no knowledge of Pluto, discovered in 1930. They couldn't see these planets because they're too far away and too dim to observe without optical aid. The claim that they somehow knew about a mysterious planet X lurking in the outer solar system beyond even Pluto is completely contradicted by their actual astronomical texts, which carefully list and describe only the planets they could actually observe. The Malapin tablets, which contain the most complete record of Babylonian astronomical knowledge compiled over centuries of observation, meticulously list all the celestial bodies they knew about: the Sun, the Moon, the 5 visible planets, major stars and constellations, and various astronomical phenomena they observed. There are no references anywhere to a 12th planet, no descriptions of anything matching Sitchin's Nibiru, no hints of hidden celestial knowledge about distant planets. Everything in their astronomical texts describes what they could actually see and measure with their available observational techniques. Third major problem: modern astronomy has thoroughly and completely debunked the possibility of Nibiru, as Sitchin described it, through multiple independent lines of evidence. An orbit that brings a large planet from beyond Pluto all the way into the inner solar system between Mars and Jupiter every 3,600 years would be gravitationally unstable over long timescales, according to well-established laws of celestial mechanics. Planetary orbits are governed by precise mathematical laws discovered by Johannes Kepler in the early 1600s and explained by Isaac Newton's law of universal gravitation. We can calculate with great precision and accuracy what kinds of orbits are stable over millions and billions of years, and which orbits would be disrupted by gravitational perturbations. A highly elliptical orbit like Sitchin proposed, especially one bringing a large planet close to the massive planets Jupiter and Saturn on every pass through the inner system, would be perturbed significantly by gravitational interactions with those giant planets. Each close passage would alter the orbit slightly. Over geological time, over millions of years, these cumulative perturbations would either eject the planet from the solar system entirely by giving it enough velocity to escape the Sun's gravity, or would circularize its orbit, bringing it into a more stable configuration, or would cause it to collide with another planet. The orbit could not maintain a regular 3,600-year cycle, as Sitchin claimed, for the hundreds of millions of years necessary for his timeline. The mathematics simply doesn't work. The physics doesn't allow it. Moreover, if such a planet existed and had the mass necessary to be habitable, to support an advanced civilization, to be a genuine world rather than a small asteroid, we would detect its gravitational influence on other objects in the solar system. This is how we've historically discovered planets we couldn't see directly. Neptune was discovered because its gravity affected Uranus's orbit in measurable ways. Astronomers calculated where Neptune must be based on those perturbations and pointed telescopes there, finding it exactly where predicted. Similarly, we've detected the probable existence of a genuine Planet 9 in the far outer solar system, much farther out than Pluto, based on gravitational effects on smaller objects in the Kuiper belt. If Nibiru existed with the orbit and mass Sitchin described, its gravitational signature would be obvious and unmistakable throughout the outer solar system. NASA has explicitly and repeatedly addressed the Nibiru claim, stating, categorically based on comprehensive evidence that no such planet exists. Multiple systematic searches for undiscovered planets have been conducted using increasingly sophisticated observational methods and instruments. We've found numerous dwarf planets in the outer solar system beyond Pluto like Eris, Makemake and Haumea. We've mapped the Kuiper belt in detail. We've detected planets around other stars thousands of light years away by observing tiny wobbles in those stars or tiny dips in their brightness. If Nibiru existed in our own solar system, even in the far outer reaches, we would have found it decades ago with current technology. Its absence from all observations despite intensive searches proves conclusively that it doesn't exist. Fourth major problem, Sitchin's claims about Sumerian knowledge of the solar system are based entirely on misinterpreting a specific cylinder seal, catalogue number VA243, held in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. Sitchin published images of this seal showing a central circle surrounded by multiple smaller circles, and he claimed this represented the Sun surrounded by all the planets of the solar system, including Nibiru, proving that Sumerians had accurate advanced astronomical knowledge given to them by extraterrestrial visitors. This seal became one of his key pieces of evidence, frequently reproduced in his books and cited by his followers as proof that ancient Mesopotamians knew things they couldn't have known without alien help. But experts who actually study cylinder seals professionally, who have examined thousands of these objects and understand their iconography, symbolism and purposes, have examined VA243 extensively and conclusively demonstrated that Sitchin's interpretation is completely wrong on multiple levels. The central symbol Sitchin identified as representing the Sun is not the Sumerian symbol for the Sun at all. Hundreds, possibly thousands, of Sumerian cylinder seals, artwork and texts depict the Sun, and we know exactly what their Sun symbol looked like because it appears consistently across numerous contexts. It's a completely different symbol from what appears on VA243. The symbol on this seal is a generic star symbol, a type used throughout Mesopotamian art to indicate divinity or celestial objects in general, not the Sun specifically. The smaller circles surrounding this central star are also stars, not planets. They're forming a constellation, or showing multiple stars around a central celestial point, a common motif in Mesopotamian astronomical and religious imagery. The seal has nothing whatsoever to do with mapping the solar system. It's showing stars in the heavens, possibly representing a deity's celestial domain or divine power symbolized through heavenly imagery. When the cuneiform inscription on VA243 is properly translated by people who can actually read Sumerian, rather than inventing meanings. It says something mundane like, "You are his servant," or similar administrative phrases extremely common on cylinder seals throughout Mesopotamian history. It's an ownership or authority seal, indicating that someone worked for someone else, or that a particular god protected a particular person. It has absolutely nothing to do with astronomy, solar systems, or planetary maps. Sitchin's interpretation was completely wrong from the beginning, based on imposing modern concepts onto ancient symbols he didn't properly understand, seeing what he wanted to see, rather than what was actually there. Fifth major problem, the gold mining claim that's central to Sitchin's entire narrative. He extensively and repeatedly asserted that the Anunnaki came to Earth to mine gold, that ancient texts described these mining operations in detail, that gold was crucial to the Anunnaki's survival because they needed it to repair their planet's atmosphere, that humans were created specifically to be miners replacing rebellious Anunnaki workers. This claim appears throughout his books and has been accepted by millions of readers as established fact. Yet when you systematically search actual Sumerian texts for references to gold mining, for descriptions of divine beings extracting gold, for stories about gods commanding humans to mine gold, you find absolutely nothing supporting this claim anywhere in the authentic literary corpus. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature is fully searchable. Anyone can look for references to gold, alluding to mining, to underground extraction. You'll find mentions of gold used in jewelry and ornaments, gold used to decorate temples and divine statues, gold given as tribute or payment to kings and temples, gold as a symbol of wealth and divine splendor. But you won't find any text anywhere describing gods mining gold, gods commanding humans to mine gold, or mining operations being established for the gods' benefit or survival. Sitchin never provided a specific citation with line numbers and tablet identifications. He never pointed to an actual tablet that says what he claims in a way that could be verified. He asserted it repeatedly, built much of his theory on this foundation, made it central to his narrative, but never actually proved it with references to real texts, because the evidence simply doesn't exist in Sumerian literature. He made it up or drastically misread something, then presented it as established fact throughout 13 books. Sixth major problem, the genetic engineering interpretation of creation myths. Sitchin read the Atrahasis and similar texts and saw genetic manipulation, laboratory procedures, in vitro fertilization, and scientific methodology because he approached these texts determined to find evidence of advanced technology. But the actual language of the text describes mythology, magic, and supernatural divine action, not science or technology. Divine blood from a sacrificed god mixed with clay from the earth, a goddess kneading and shaping the mixture with her hands, sacred incantations spoken over the forming humans, divine will and power animating the inanimate clay into living beings with consciousness. This is creation through ritual and divine supernatural power, described in exactly the same mode as creation myths from cultures worldwide that had no contact with Mesopotamia. To interpret this as a description of laboratory genetic engineering using modern biotechnology requires systematically ignoring the actual words on the tablets, ignoring the genre and literary mode, ignoring the cultural context that produced these texts, and imposing a modern technological framework onto a narrative that operates in a completely different conceptual mode. It's like reading Greek myths about Athena being born fully formed from Zeus's head after Hephaestus split his skull with an axe, and concluding that ancient Greeks must have had advanced brain surgery techniques and cloning technology, because how else could someone emerge from another person's head? You're forcing a literal modern scientific reading onto poetic mythological narrative that was never intended to be technical description of actual events. The text is operating as mythology, using symbolic narrative to explain origins, purpose, and cosmic relationships through story. That's what mythology does. That's how it functions. Treating it as if it were a scientific report or technical manual misunderstands its nature and purpose completely. Seventh major problem, Sitchin claimed the Great Flood described in Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, and other texts was an actual historical global event caused or allowed by the Anunnaki aliens who decided to eliminate their human creations. but flooding was a regular and devastating occurrence in Mesopotamia throughout ancient history. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded frequently and often catastrophically, destroying cities, killing thousands, wiping out agricultural production. These weren't minor events. They were regional catastrophes that shaped Mesopotamian life and psychology. Archaeological evidence shows flood layers at various ancient sites throughout Mesopotamia, physical evidence of catastrophic flooding events that destroyed settlements at different times. There's no evidence of a single global flood that covered the entire planet, as described in the myths, but there's abundant evidence of repeated, devastating regional floods in Mesopotamia, specifically that would have seemed world-ending to people whose entire known world was that river valley. The flood stories in Mesopotamian literature reflect this harsh reality. They're mythologized accounts of catastrophic floods that actually happened in historical memory, interpreted through religious framework as divine decisions or punishment, because that's how their theological worldview explained natural disasters. Every culture creates myths explaining catastrophic events they experienced or remembered. The flood. Myths don't describe aliens deciding to wipe out genetic experiments. They describe how ancient peoples understood devastating natural disasters that killed thousands and destroyed everything they knew, attributing those disasters to God's decisions because their religion explained causation through divine will rather than through natural processes and meteorological phenomena. Eighth, and perhaps most fundamental problem, Sitchin's entire framework rests on the deeply flawed and frankly insulting assumption that ancient peoples couldn't have achieved what they demonstrably achieved without alien help or intervention. This assumption reveals more about modern biases than about ancient capabilities. It's insulting to our ancestors and thoroughly contradicted by archaeological and historical evidence. The development of writing in Mesopotamia, for example, is completely traceable through archaeological record across centuries. We have thousands of tablets showing the clear progression from simple pictographs, representing concrete objects, to increasingly abstract logograms, to phonetic elements, to fully developed cuneiform script capable of expressing any thought in the Sumerian language. We can see each stage of evolution. We can watch literacy spreading through society over generations. We can observe scribal schools teaching the system to new students. There's no mysterious jump requiring alien explanation. There's just humans gradually improving a technology through trial, error, innovation, and transmission of knowledge. Similarly, Sumerian mathematics and astronomy show completely natural development over many centuries of careful observation and incremental advancement. They made observations of the sky night after night, generation after generation. They recorded data on clay tablets that accumulated over centuries. They noticed patterns in celestial movements. They developed mathematical methods to calculate and predict phenomena. Their astronomical knowledge was genuinely impressive for what could be achieved through patient naked-eye observation, but it was limited to what they could actually see and measure with their available tools and techniques. They didn't know about planets beyond Saturn because those planets aren't visible without telescopes. They couldn't calculate things that required mathematical concepts they hadn't yet developed. Their knowledge was impressive but entirely consistent with human achievement without alien intervention. Their architecture similarly shows steady development through time. Early structures in Mesopotamia were simple, made from mud brick, functional but not elaborate. Over centuries, techniques improved through experimentation and accumulated knowledge. Buildings became more complex and sophisticated. Ziggurats grew taller and more elaborate as engineers learned what worked and what didn't. We can trace this progression through archaeological excavation, seeing earlier, simpler structures, underneath later, more advanced ones, observing how techniques evolved and improved. No aliens needed, just humans learning from experience, innovating solutions to problems, building on previous generations' work, and gradually developing more sophisticated capabilities. Every single aspect of Sumerian civilization that Sitchin attributed to alien intervention can be fully explained through normal human ingenuity, creativity, and development, when you actually look at the evidence rather than starting with the assumption that humans couldn't have done it. The only reason to invoke aliens is if you begin with a prejudiced assumption that ancient humans were too primitive, too stupid, too limited to accomplish what they clearly and demonstrably accomplished. But that assumption is factually wrong and reveals bias rather than evidence. Ancient peoples were just as intelligent as we are today. They had the same cognitive capabilities, the same capacity for innovation and abstract thought and problem-solving. They lacked our accumulated scientific knowledge built over thousands of years, but they had the same brains, the same creativity, the same determination. Given time, motivation and resources, they could achieve remarkable things, and they did. So what becomes of the Anunnaki in our properly informed understanding based on what ancient texts actually say? They remain fascinating and worthy of study, but not as aliens from another planet. They're interesting and significant as what they actually were. A window into Sumerian theology and mythology, a glimpse into how ancient Mesopotamians understood cosmic order and divine hierarchy. Studying them properly teaches us about ancient beliefs, about how our species has always tried to explain the mysterious aspects of existence, about the universal human need to tell stories that make sense of death, suffering, justice, and our place in the cosmos. The Anunnaki as gods tell us infinitely more about humanity than the Anunnaki as aliens ever could. Gods reveal what a culture values, what they fear, what they aspire to become. Gods embody the questions a society struggles with, personifying abstract concepts like justice, love, war, wisdom, death. The Sumerian divine world, with its complex hierarchies and conflicts, with its gods who are powerful but fallible, who create but also destroy, who demand service but also depend on worship, reflects a sophisticated understanding that power is complicated and multifaceted, that justice is difficult to achieve and maintain, that the forces shaping our world are not simple or easily comprehended, that even divine authority has limits and obligations. The Anunnaki were not ancient astronauts visiting from distant planets. They were gods in Sumerian and Akkadian religion, powerful divine beings who judged the dead, decreed fates, and participated in cosmic events according to their assigned roles. They were described, understood, and worshipped in ways entirely consistent with deities in every other ancient culture, with powers and characteristics appropriate to divine beings in religious mythology. They were products of human religious imagination and theological reflection, not visitors from the stars. The real story of the Anunnaki is ultimately the story of humanity itself, the story of how we developed civilization from small agricultural villages to great cities, the story of how we created religion to explain existence and provide meaning, the story of how we invented writing to preserve knowledge and communicate across time, the story of how we told stories, sang songs, composed poetry and created art, the story of how we grappled with profound questions about life, death, justice and purpose, the story of how we left records of our existence, our beliefs, our hopes and fears, preserved in clay for future generations. The story of how we reached across 5,000 years of time to connect with each other through written words. We don't need aliens to make ancient Mesopotamia interesting or impressive or significant. It's endlessly fascinating because real people built it. Real human beings, as intelligent and creative as anyone alive today, but working with vastly less accumulated knowledge and much more limited technology, achieved remarkable things through cooperation, innovation, persistence, and dedication. They invented writing from scratch. They created sophisticated legal systems. They built great cities with complex infrastructure. They developed mathematics and astronomy. They created enduring literature and art. They established religions that addressed the deepest human questions. And they did all of this themselves, without help from extraterrestrial visitors, proving what humans are capable of when given time, motivation, and freedom to innovate. The Sumerians are our ancestors, not necessarily in a direct genetic sense, but certainly in a cultural and intellectual sense that connects us across millennia. Every time you check the time and see it divided into hours, minutes, and seconds, you're using their base 60 mathematical system that they developed for astronomical calculations. Every time you appreciate a good story with developed characters and dramatic structure, you're engaging with literary traditions they helped establish through works like Gilgamesh. Every time you write something down to preserve information or communicate ideas, you're participating in an innovation they pioneered when they pressed marks into wet clay. The legacy of Mesopotamian civilization lives on in countless ways we rarely notice or acknowledge, embedded deep in the foundations of modern culture. The Anunnaki survive not as historical aliens who visited Earth in ancient times, but as mythology, as part of humanity's vast cultural heritage spanning thousands of years and countless civilizations. They survive in clay tablets housed carefully in museums, worldwide preserved for study and appreciation. They survive in scholarly translations that make ancient texts accessible to modern readers. They survive in academic courses about ancient Near Eastern religion taught at universities. They survive as examples of how religions develop and change over time, how divine hierarchies reflect social structures, how humans have always sought to explain the world and their place in it through stories about powerful beings who shaped reality. The tablets don't lie when read honestly by people trained to read them. They say what they say, and we can read them accurately using well-established linguistic knowledge accumulated over more than a century of scholarly work. The Anunnaki were gods, members of the Mesopotamian pantheon, judges and administrators with specific divine roles in maintaining cosmic order. They were not aliens, despite persistent modern reinterpretation by people who can't or won't read the texts accurately. No amount of wishful thinking, creative interpretation, or determined misreading will change what the ancient texts actually say when approached honestly. So the next time someone tells you confidently that Sumerian texts prove ancient astronauts visited Earth, that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials who genetically engineered humanity to be a slave species, that ancient civilizations couldn't possibly have achieved what they did without alien help or advanced technology from outside sources, you'll know better. You'll know those claims rest entirely on mistranslations and misinterpretations by someone with no proper training. You'll know that actual experts, people who can genuinely read the languages and have dedicated careers to studying these cultures, unanimously reject these theories as pseudo-archaeology. You'll know that the evidence, when examined honestly and carefully by qualified scholars, tells a completely different story from what ancient astronaut theorists claim. A story about real human beings achieving remarkable things through their own efforts and ingenuity. A story about the development of civilization through human creativity, cooperation, and persistent innovation over many generations. A story about sophisticated theology and beautiful literature created by our ancestors who are just as intelligent as we are. A story about people who looked at the stars and imagined gods dwelling there, who pressed marks into clay and invented writing to preserve their thoughts, who built cities and temples and created cultures that influenced human history for thousands of years and still influence us today in ways we rarely recognize. That's the real story, and honestly, it's more than enough. It's inspiring, humbling, and deeply meaningful without requiring aliens or conspiracy or hidden knowledge. The Anunnaki were survivors in the truest and most profound sense. They survived through the enduring power of story preserved across millennia, through words, pressed into clay tablets that outlasted empires and civilizations, through the dedication of countless scholars who recovered and translated these ancient voices, through our continued interest in understanding where we came from and how our ancestors made sense of their world. They were not gods who literally walked the earth with actual supernatural powers performing miracles. They were not aliens who descended from distant planets to mine gold and engineer DNA. They were ideas, concepts, characters in stories that served profound purposes for the people who created them and told them and listened to them in ancient temples. They were humanity's attempt to understand cosmic forces beyond their control, to explain existence and suffering and death, to find meaning and purpose in a mysterious and often harsh universe. And in that sense, they were and remain deeply, fundamentally, beautifully human. The clay tablets will continue to be studied by new generations of scholars using ever-improving methods. New discoveries will undoubtedly refine our understanding of Mesopotamian religion and culture. The conversation about what these texts mean and what they reveal about ancient civilization will continue evolving as we learn more. But one thing is absolutely certain based on everything we know now. The more we learn about actual Sumerian civilization through proper scholarship, rigorous methodology, and honest engagement with evidence, the more we understand that they needed no aliens, no outside intervention, no extraterrestrial help whatsoever. They were humans, fully capable and remarkably creative, building civilization literally from the ground up through their own blood, sweat, determination, and brilliance. The Anunnaki myths, understood properly and honestly, celebrate human achievement rather than diminishing it by attributing it to aliens. They show us people grappling with the biggest questions existence poses, creating sophisticated theological systems to explain reality, producing enduring literature that still speaks across 5,000 years, leaving a legacy that spans millennia and continues enriching human culture. That legacy deserves our respect, our honest inquiry, our commitment to understanding it on its own terms rather than twisting it to fit modern fantasies about ancient astronauts. Thank you for joining me on this comprehensive journey through ancient Mesopotamia, through actual Sumerian texts read honestly, through the real story of who and what the Anunnaki actually were. If you found this deep exploration valuable, if it changed your understanding or gave you tools to evaluate extraordinary claims more critically, please like this video and subscribe to this channel for more thoroughly researched investigations into history, mythology, and the enduring questions that connect us to our ancestors across vast expanses of time. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, questions, or reactions. The conversation continues, and your perspective adds valuable dimensions to our collective understanding of these ancient mysteries. Until next time, keep questioning everything you're told, keep learning from qualified experts who have relevant knowledge, and always demand solid evidence for extraordinary claims before accepting them as truth. The truth of the past is remarkable enough without embellishment, exaggeration, or invention. The real achievements of ancient civilizations stand powerfully on their own, testifying to human creativity and potential across thousands of years without requiring alien intervention to explain them. The Anunnaki were not gods in the literal supernatural sense, and they were certainly not aliens from another planet. They were concepts, stories, expressions of ancient spirituality and culture created by people trying to understand their world. They were, in the most profound way possible, survivors who lived on through the power of written word preserved in clay, waiting patiently for 5,000 years for us to rediscover them and finally understand what they truly meant to the people who first imagined them into existence. Good night, and may your curiosity always lead you toward truth rather than comfortable fantasy.